The school bell rang, and the sixth graders were blown out of the corridors as if by the wind. Everyone hurried to take their seats before the first lesson began. It was a normal day for teacher Sarah Wilson. She was in her 10th year at the school and considered herself an experienced teacher. Restrained, strict, always convinced that order and discipline were the key to success. Her methods were not always to the students' liking, but the management valued her for her consistent results. However, behind her outward adamance lay something much darker. Sarah believed that some students were born to succeed and others were not. Today was a special day. A new student was joining the class. Sarah flipped through the magazine, waiting for him to appear. There was a knock on the door, and a tall boy with short-cropped hair stepped into the classroom. "You're new," she said without lifting her head from the magazine. "Take the last desk, James Carter, right?" "Yes, ma'am," the boy replied calmly, his voice quiet but full of confidence. He walked to the back of the classroom, ignoring the curious stares of his classmates. Sarah looked up and scrutinized the new student. He was black, tall for his age, with a straight posture and a nonchalant expression. Her heart clenched, but not from sympathy or interest. It was an instant resentment that had been ingrained deep in her mind, ever since her parents had taught her that the different races should stay where they were. James looked confident and calm, which only irritated Sarah more. She didn't like students like that, students who she thought might question her authority. And the fact that this boy was black only made her more annoyed. "He's too cocky for someone like him," she thought. "Okay, class," she interrupted her thoughts. "Let's begin the lesson. Today we are going to learn the basics of geography. Carter, she turned sharply to the new student. "Tell us what you know about the continents." There was silence in the classroom. Everyone turned their eyes to James, waiting to see how he would react to such an unexpected challenge. "Well," James began calmly, "there are 7 continents: North America, South America, Africa, Europe, Asia, Australia, and Antarctica." Sarah gritted her teeth. She hadn't expected the boy to answer so confidently and correctly. Usually freshmen were timid and stilted, but not James. "That's basic information, Carter," she replied coldly. "You should have given more detail. Try harder next time." James nodded, showing no resentment or embarrassment. He just continued to follow the lesson, jotting down important points in his notebook. Sarah felt that her attempt to belittle him had failed, and that only made her more irritated. James was a threat to her, not just because he was new, but because his confidence seemed inappropriate for a student she considered inferior. When class was over, Sarah took another look at James. He had already made friends with a few of his classmates, quietly discussing things with them. She noticed that some of the kids perceived him as a leader. "It won't last," she thought. "I'm not going to let him gain authority in the classroom so easily." But something was troubling her. She didn't know what kind of personality was behind this boy, who his parents were. All she saw was his confidence, which she didn't like. Sarah didn't know that what lay ahead of her was not just a conflict with a student, but a clash with forces far more powerful than her prejudice and hatred. With each new lesson, the tension between Sarah Wilson and James Carter grew, and everyone in the class could feel it. James hadn't tried to stand out from the start, but his quiet confidence and impeccable work ethic irritated Sarah. She began to notice things in his behavior that she felt didn't fit the norms she had set in the classroom. It started with little things. As the students completed their assignments, Sarah began to approach James more often, watching him closely as he wrote and answered the questions. If someone else made a mistake, she could overlook it or calmly correct it. But when James made even the slightest slip, Sarah stopped in front of his desk and commented on every detail with a rigor she didn't show to others. "You're writing too sloppily again, Carter," she said sharply one day, leaning over his notebook. "That's unacceptable in my class. You lack the discipline to be successful." James looked up at her, his eyes expressing calmness, but a sense of injustice was growing inside. He knew that the other students weren't always neat either, but none of them were under this kind of pressure. However, he didn't say anything. "Fix this and do it normally," Sarah added, tossing his notebook back onto the desk so that the pages crumpled. The class froze as they watched the teacher humiliate James again. Many were embarrassed, but no one dared to interfere. Sarah began to pay more attention to his work, finding mistakes where others might not even notice them. Carter, you did the assignment wrong, she would say the next time, even though his work was accurate. How are you even going to study further if you can't even get it right? She was obviously deliberately looking for an excuse to pick on him. James continued to tolerate it, though he was beginning to harbor a latent anger. Every time Sarah publicly humiliated him, he reminded himself of his father's words, "Don't let them lead you astray. Stay above it." But every day it became harder and harder to ignore her bullying. She began to pick on even the way he spoke. "Your accent, Carter," she said wryly once. "You have to talk right if you want to get anywhere. This way you sound like everyone else who's never going to get anywhere." The words burned him like boiling water. James clenched his fists under the desk, trying not to give away his feelings. He knew it was a clear implication of his origins, of the color of his skin. There was a cold hatred in her voice, disguised as professional concern for learning. The other students noticed how she treated him and them differently. When Tommy, a white boy, wrote a test with many mistakes, Sarah simply remarked in passing, "Tommy, do better next time." But when James made one tiny mistake in grammar, Sarah became furious. "Can't you even do that right, Carter? Maybe you don't belong in this class." James began to feel like an outsider in a space that was supposed to be safe. He realized that every move he made and every word he spoke was being examined under a microscope that Sarah turned on just for him. To others, she was just a strict teacher, but to James, she was the nightmarish embodiment of bias and racism. On one of the quizzes, Sarah went even further. As she handed out the results, James noticed that he had gotten significantly lower than he had expected. His answers were correct, but Sarah had deliberately lowered the marks by pointing out that his answers were not detailed enough. James knew this was a lie. His answers were detailed and accurate. He had seen her give other students higher marks for work that was clearly inferior to his. "Carter," Sarah said coldly when he came up to her after class to ask about his grade, "you need to try harder. Your effort is not up to the level of this class." James tried to calmly reply, "Ma'am, but I answered all the questions correctly. Why did I get that grade?" "Because your idea of rightness is clearly not the same as what's required in this class," she said wryly. "You may think you're special, Carter, but you're not. Success is something you have to earn, and you're far from it." Her words were filled with latent hatred. It was more than professional criticism. It was a clear signal: you don't belong here, and I'll make sure you realize it. James fell silent. At that moment, he realized that the situation had gone too far. Her prejudice wasn't just an annoyance. It was a weapon she was deliberately wounding him with, trying to crush his confidence and dignity. But she didn't know the main thing. James Carter was the governor's son, and that truth would soon come crashing down on her like an avalanche, changing everything around her. Every new day at school was a challenge for James Carter. Sarah Wilson, the teacher who was supposed to be a fair mentor, was turning into his personal enemy. Her bias was becoming more and more blatant and cruel. James was doing better than many of his classmates, often outperforming them in tests and quizzes. But Sarah didn't like it. Her anger and hatred seemed to grow as James showed that he was capable of not just learning, but excelling. Every class was now a battlefield. Sarah no longer hid her contempt for James. In front of the entire class, she looked for any excuse to belittle him. Any mistake, even the smallest, became a public humiliation. She emphasized his blunders by shouting them in front of the whole class, making him blush in humiliation. "Carter!" she shouted once, interrupting a lesson when he made a small mistake in a math equation. "Don't you get it at all? It's elementary. How are you going to study further if you can't handle such simple problems? Maybe you're just not capable, Carter. Not everyone is born with a brain." Her voice was full of venom. The classmates froze, and James felt his face flush with heat. He knew his mistake was a small one, and he had seen other students make much more serious blunders. But none of them had gotten this much attention. He clenched his fists, trying to contain his emotions. In that moment, he realized that this was no longer just professional, stern criticism. It was something personal. "Do you have trouble understanding, Carter?" Sarah continued, and her words sounded like an insult. "Maybe they don't teach you enough at home? Or is it just natural? Genetic?" She emphasized the last word on purpose, and a silent wave of shock swept through the class. Everyone realized what she meant. James remained silent, feeling his chest tighten with anger and humiliation. He knew that arguing with her would only make things worse, but the silence was also unbearable. With each lesson, she demonstrated her hatred more and more. One day when James handed in a paper that was perfect, she refused to recognize his success. In front of the whole class, Sarah returned his work, throwing it on the desk with contempt. "It's not your job. You couldn't have done it yourself. Someone must have helped you. People like you aren't capable of that." Her eyes glittered with hatred, and everyone in the class could see that she had crossed the line. James sat there, unable to believe what he was hearing. His work was flawless. He was proud of it, knew he had put a lot of effort into it. But Sarah couldn't accept that. It was unbearable to her that a black student she considered inferior could be the best in the class. "Do you think you can accomplish anything?" Her voice sounded like a hiss. "There's no future for you, Carter. There's nothing. You can try as hard as you want, but in the end, you'll always be behind." Those words sounded like a verdict. She was no longer ashamed of her true thoughts and openly broadcast her racist beliefs. James felt that with every insult she hurled at him, something inside him was breaking. He was no longer able to remain calm as his father had advised. He wanted to respond, but knew it would only make things worse. She began to look for reasons to pick on his appearance. One day when James came to class in his new clothes, Sarah grinned cynically. "Carter, did you pick out that suit yourself? Or did someone help you? 'Cause it's not really your style. Trying to look like you're one of us? That's ridiculous." Her comment sounded like a slap in the face. She was deliberately emphasizing the boundary of us and them, dividing the students into those she considered acceptable and those she didn't think should be here. James remained silent, but his eyes burned with restrained rage. Sarah started calling him to the board more and more often, trying to catch him making mistakes in front of the whole class. If he answered correctly, she pretended it wasn't good enough. If he made the slightest inaccuracy, he was in for a public humiliation. "Carter, how did you even get into this school?" she once asked with a venomous smile. "Did someone push you in here? Because according to your results, you shouldn't be here." James felt anger boiling up inside him, but he held back again. At that moment, he made a decision. He wouldn't react to her provocations, but he wouldn't stay silent. That afternoon, when he got home, he told his father everything that had happened at school. Governor John Carter listened silently, but his eyes darkened with anger. "I'm on it, James," my father said quietly but firmly. "She's going to find out who you are and what kind of family you have behind you." Governor John Carter was a man who knew how to handle power, but Sarah Wilson didn't. She continued her attacks on James, confident of her impunity. She had no idea that her career and reputation hung in the balance. Soon everything would change, and the blow that would follow would be devastating. James held back for a long time. Every day he came to class expecting another attack from Ms. Wilson. Her racist comments, her cynical taunts, and her biased grades were becoming unbearable for him. He was used to fighting injustice, but Sarah had managed to hurt him more deeply than anyone had before. Her hatred wasn't casual or hidden. It seemed part of who she was. After returning home one evening, James sat in the kitchen across from his father, Governor John Carter. His father was scrutinizing some documents, but James felt that he could no longer remain silent. He took a deep breath and decided to speak. "Dad, I need to talk to you," James said, trying to remain calm despite the storm of emotions inside. The governor broke away from his papers and looked at his son, seeing the serious expression on his face. "Did something happen at school?" he asked, putting the papers aside. James hesitated before he started to speak. He didn't want to complain, but the situation had gone too far. "That's my teacher, Miss Wilson. She hates me." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Every day she picks on me. She humiliates me in front of the whole class, always looking for a reason to pick on me, accusing me of not trying, even though my grades are higher than most. But she always finds something to punish me for." James tried to speak calmly, but his voice broke with anger. He knew his father was used to hardship and injustice, but even he couldn't imagine what his son was going through. Governor Carter looked at James thoughtfully. It's a serious accusation, son, he said, his voice steady, but there was a hidden worry in his eyes. Are you sure she's biased against you? James clenched his fists, remembering all the humiliation he had to endure. She doesn't do that to others, he replied confidently. She says things that make it clear that it's not about how I learn. She hates me for who I am. She hints at it every time. Father listened intently and then asked another question. What exactly is she saying? James was silent for a moment, searching for words. Memories of Ms. Wilson's cruel comments surfaced in his mind. She says that people like me can't be successful, that my genetics keep me from learning, that I can't be like other people. And she calls me Carter all the time, as if that name means something to her, but she says it with contempt. Every time I try, she says it's not my progress, that someone is helping me because I can't do it on my own. She doesn't even try to hide that she hates me because of the color of my skin. Governor Carter pressed his lips together when he heard that. The anger inside him was building, but he tried to stay calm so as not to add fuel to the fire. Did you tell anyone else about it? He asked. No, James answered, lowering his head slightly. I don't want everyone to know who you are. I didn't use your name to push her. I wanted to figure it out on my own, but I can't keep quiet anymore. His father nodded understandingly, but a fire flared in his eyes that James rarely saw. John Carter was a man of power, and when it came to his family, he didn't forgive injustice. You did the right thing to tell me, he said, sitting down closer. But it's important not to let her break you now. She wants you to snap, to show weakness. I know people like that, James. She won't stop until she gets what she wants. But you have to rise above it. She doesn't know who you are, and that's her mistake. James realized that his father was right. Ms. Wilson didn't know who his father was, and her hatred was directed at him simply as another student she considered beneath her. His father continued, I know what it's like to face hate. It's important to maintain your dignity and not give them any reason to think they've won. Be patient. I'll deal with it. But you, James, you have to keep going despite all of this. This is a challenge, and it will make you stronger. James nodded, feeling his anger slowly dissolve under the weight of his father's wise counsel. But he knew that every day at school would continue to be the same hell as long as Sarah Wilson continued to lead his class. His father was clearly going to do something about it, but when it would happen and exactly how, James didn't know. He just hoped he could hold out until then. The next day, James re-entered the classroom with the confidence his father had instilled in him, but Sarah Wilson seemed to sense his inner change. She noticed at once that James was not broken, that there was no longer fear in his gaze. Late again, Carter? She asked caustically, even though James was on time. Do you think the rules aren't for you, or do you just think your time is more important than everyone else's? She tried to corner him again, but James didn't give her the opportunity. He calmly sat back in his seat, ignoring her another taunt. Sarah frowned. Her hatred grew each time she saw his indifference to her attacks. What she didn't know was that behind this boy's back was the power she would face. However, her bias was not without consequences. A few days later, a letter arrived at the school. Governor Carter, without revealing himself directly, filed a formal complaint about Miss Wilson's behavior. It was the beginning of the end of her tyranny. She didn't yet know that the clouds had begun to thicken and that her career, her life, would all be jeopardized when the truth came out. It was a gray and gloomy day at school, as if nature sensed that something bad was brewing. In Ms. Wilson's classroom, the silence was too thick. The students could feel the tension in the air. Sarah Wilson entered the classroom with an expression of cold displeasure on her face, and everyone knew that her mood was particularly angry today. She had been looking tense as of late. Something was troubling her, but no one knew what it was. One thing was certain, however. Someone was going to get hurt today, and most of the classmates guessed that that someone would be James Carter. James, sitting in the back of the desk, could feel the storm approaching. For the past few days, he had noticed Sarah watching him with displeasure, her eyes blazing with a hidden hatred. She couldn't get over his calmness and confidence, which had begun to annoy her more than ever. He didn't look broken anymore, and it was driving her crazy. When class began, Sarah coldly turned the topic of discussion to the math assignment, though her thoughts were clearly far from the topic. She glanced around the classroom several times, like a predator looking for its prey. Finally, her gaze settled on James. "Carter, come to the board." Her voice was icy, her eyes burning with contempt. James stood up quietly and walked to the blackboard, feeling the stares of his classmates. Some of them realized that something terrible was about to happen. Others were just curious. Sarah pointed out a complicated equation, but James, despite the strain, instantly understood the problem. He started to write down the solution when he heard her sharp voice. "Are you stalling on purpose, Carter? Is this really that hard for you?" There was contempt in her tone. "Why should I be surprised? Why should I expect more from someone like you?" Ms. Wilson's words sounded like a slap in the face. The classroom fell silent. The students began to glance around, sensing that the situation was getting out of control. James stopped for a moment but continued writing, trying not to react. He was determined not to give her a reason to attack him further, but that only served to irritate her. "I'm talking to you, Carter," she shouted, stepping closer to him. "You think you can pretend to be smart, but in reality, you're not. You're not capable of it, no matter how hard you try." Her voice now had a distinctly racist undertone to it, and it was obvious to everyone in the class. Sarah wasn't just belittling James for his knowledge. She was attacking him for who he was. Her contempt and hatred spewed out with every word. "Maybe you should go back to where you came from." She stepped closer, her eyes burning with anger. "You don't belong here. This school is not for people like you. You belong in the back. You'll never be like us, no matter how hard you try." It was more than humiliation. It was an open expression of racial hatred. Sarah Wilson was no longer holding back. She was deliberately provoking James, wanting to see him broken, wanting him to snap and thereby confirm her beliefs. James stood in front of the board, feeling a wave of rage wash over him. He couldn't ignore her attacks anymore, but he couldn't give in either. He clenched the marker in his hand, looking directly at her, trying to keep his cool. In that moment, he realized that she wanted to get him to retaliate, to make him lose control. But Sarah didn't stop. Her face reddened with anger, and she moved toward him like a beast ready to attack. "What, Carter? You can't answer that?" she hissed. "Or is it your blood that's keeping you from thinking? Maybe you should go back to the farm where you were born. You'd be in your place there." It was an insult that made even the most insensitive students gasp. Ms. Wilson had crossed a line that no longer left any doubt about her racist views. James felt his heart beating with redoubled vigor, but he wouldn't let her see his pain. His hands trembled, but he wouldn't let himself give up. "Why don't you say anything?" she continued with a venomous grin. "Because you know I'm right. You'll never be like the others. You're capable of nothing but being a burden to society. You and your kind are only a hindrance to us." James felt anger boiling in his chest, but he didn't give in to his emotions. He stared at her, realizing that she had lost control of herself. Her eyes burned with hatred, and now she couldn't hide it even in front of her students. Sarah turned to the class as if seeking approval from her students. "Do you all see who he really is?" Her voice was full of venom. "He will never be like us, and you children must remember that. Never let people like him think they are on the same level as you." But her words did not elicit the expected approval. There was dead silence in the classroom, and even the most loyal students looked at her with bewilderment. They couldn't believe that their teacher, the one they were supposed to trust, would allow herself to do such a thing. At that moment, the classroom door slowly opened. The headmaster walked in, followed by a dignified man in a strict suit, Governor John Carter. The events of the fateful lesson, when Sarah Wilson openly humiliated James in front of the whole class, did not leave his classmates indifferent. Even the most indifferent children could not accept the fact that the teacher they were supposed to trust had allowed herself to make such extreme remarks. Some of the students, despite their fear of Ms. Wilson, decided to go to the principal. A few hours after class, a small group of students were already gathered in the office of the school principal, Mr. Thompson. Among them was Lisa, one of the best students in the class, who usually stayed away from any conflicts. But today she decided that she could not stay silent any longer. "Mr. Thompson," Lisa began, a little nervously, "we need to talk to you about Miss Wilson's class. What happened today was horrible." She started humiliating James again. It wasn't just humiliation, Peter, James' classmate interrupted her. She had spoken out against him openly because he was black. She called him incapable and said things that, it was racist. Principal Thompson, a middle-aged man with graying temples and a tired look, listened to the students, but his face remained impassive. He was aware of the conflict between Ms. Wilson and James, but he preferred not to interfere, hoping that the situation would somehow resolve itself. I understand your concern, children, he said softly, trying to remain neutral. But Ms. Wilson is an experienced educator. She may simply be too hard on James, but that doesn't necessarily mean her behavior is racist. Lisa couldn't stand it. She said that James couldn't be on the same level as us, that people like him are a hindrance to society. That's not just strictness, Mr. Thompson. It's racist. The director sighed heavily, feeling the situation spinning out of control. He didn't want to stir up conflict, especially when it involved racial tension. There were enough problems around the school as it was, and the last thing he wanted was to draw public attention. Children, I understand your concern, but let's think about the consequences, he began gently. Accusations of racism are very serious. We can't just accuse a teacher with years of experience. Ms. Wilson has always been a dedicated educator, and I'm sure her words were simply misunderstood. Peter frowned, his eyes blazing with anger. Misunderstood? He couldn't believe his ears. She literally said that he was different and that he didn't belong in our society. It's not a misunderstanding, Mr. Thompson. She hates him for who he was born to be. We all heard it, Lisa added. The whole class heard it. You're not just going to let it go, are you? The principal sensed that the situation was beginning to heat up. He realized that it would be difficult to cover up such an incident if the whole class witnessed it. But Thompson was afraid of the consequences. If it went public, his career might be in jeopardy. Don't get me wrong, he continued with a slight strain in his voice. I can't accuse a respected teacher without evidence. It could affect not only her career, but also the reputation of the school. We cannot act hastily. Lisa squinted indignantly. What about James, she threw. Doesn't his future matter to you? Or do you think he doesn't belong here either? Mr. Thompson felt a cold sweat pour down his back. He had not expected the students to be so persistent. He looked around as if searching for support among the empty walls of his office. I'll have a discussion with Ms. Wilson, he said finally, trying to speak as calmly as possible. We will discuss the incident, but please don't spread this outside the school. We all need to stay calm and deal with these matters internally. You're just afraid of a scandal, Peter shouted, his voice shaking with anger. What if it had been one of us? Or is it okay if the victim is a black student? Thompson froze for a moment, his lips pressed into a thin line. He knew they were right, but he was afraid to admit it. It's not as easy as it looks, he began desperately, but his words didn't matter anymore. The students could see that he wasn't going to defend James. Peter clenched his fists, turning to face Lisa and the others. Let's go, he said over his shoulder. We'll get nowhere here. When the students left the room, leaving Thompson in a silent stupor, he was alone in his struggle with his inner fears. He knew he had to do something, but fear of repercussions and public scrutiny restrained him. Deep inside, however, the principal knew that this conflict would not go unnoticed, and that he would soon have to face something much bigger than just a student complaint. James came to school the next day with the same calm confidence, even though he was still seething inside. He had managed to restrain himself in the previous lesson when Miss Wilson had overstepped her bounds. But after that, he felt his patience was running out. His father had told him to be restrained and not to react, but James couldn't keep quiet any longer when the teacher started her attacks again. Sarah Wilson entered the classroom with the same icy expression on her face. It was as if she was deliberately looking for an excuse to attack again. Her rage after James hadn't broken down last time had only intensified. She seemed to feel humiliated that her words hadn't worked as she had hoped. Tonight she needed to go further to break him completely. As soon as class started, she stared at James again, as if he was the culprit for all her troubles. Carter, hiding in the back of the desk again? she began, taking a break from her papers. You think if you sit quietly, I'll forget about you. You can't hide in here. James looked at her silently, not answering. He felt his classmates hold their breath. After what had happened last class, everyone knew that Sarah was ready for more attacks. But something was different about her tone today. There was more venom in it than ever before. Why aren't you talking, Carter? Her voice grew louder and louder, causing tension in the classroom. Do you think that because your skin is different, you're special? You think you're allowed to be here more than others? You're not on the street here. You have to fit in. She stepped closer to his desk, her eyes throwing lightning bolts. I guess you think that if you're so important, you can get away with anything, don't you? She hissed, hovering over him. Maybe you have some kind of patron? Maybe your people are used to threats and intimidation to get their way. James looked her straight in the eye and said calmly, I'm not threatening, but yes, my father is a powerful man. There was a tense silence in the classroom. The students froze, looking at James and Sarah. The statement sounded like something new and unexpected. At first, they didn't understand what he meant, but soon they began to whisper. Sarah Wilson couldn't hold back a smile that stretched into a wicked grin. Oh, is that so? Her voice sounded with a feigned courtesy that hid contempt. An influential man, you say? Well then, perhaps I should be frightened? She took a step back, folding her arms theatrically across her chest. You think because you have a rich daddy, you can do whatever you want? She laughed, low, evil, without a trace of humor. I'll tell you what, Carter. Her tone became hard, cold. There's no room for privilege in this class. You're just like everyone else and worse. A powerful father isn't going to help you get out of the shit you're already in. James clenched his jaws, but continued to remain calm. My father is the governor of the state, he finally said quietly but distinctly. Sarah Wilson froze in place. Her smile vanished as if someone had turned off the lights. A shadow of doubt flashed in her eyes, but hatred quickly took over. She didn't believe him, couldn't believe him. Governor, then? She interjected, but her voice was full of sarcasm. What do you think that's going to change? You think someone's going to save you because you have a governor daddy? She raised her voice sharply, her anger clearly spilling out. That's an empty threat. You're no better than anyone else. And you know what I think? I think you're just lying to avoid responsibility for your worthlessness. Her words sounded like a sentence. With each insult, it was like she was hammering nails into the image of James she was trying to destroy in front of the class. Do you think your family means anything? Her voice turned cold, almost sizzling. I've seen your kind. You think you can threaten teachers with your privilege? But you know what? That's not going to work here. Your father's a nobody here. You're nobody. James stared at her, his eyes burning with a quiet fire. I'm not threatening, Ms. Wilson, he repeated, his voice still firm. I'm just warning you. You've already gone too far. Her face contorted with anger, and she stepped toward him, her voice almost a hiss. You dare threaten me, you lowlife. You dare to think you have any power? She slammed her palm on his desk, causing several students to shriek in surprise. Your skin color, your family, nothing will help you. You will always stand below the rest, and no one, not your father or anyone else, can save you. Sarah stopped, realizing that the entire class was looking at her. Her words resonated in the minds of the students, many of whom were beginning to realize the enormity of what was happening. But Ms. Wilson didn't hold back. Her hatred for James and his defiance had peaked. She turned to the class, her eyes blazing. Here's what I want you all to understand, she said with obvious contempt. No one should think they can get privileges because of skin color or position. People like Carter need to be put in their place, and I'm going to do it. But at that moment, she no longer realized that she had crossed the line beyond which her career was in jeopardy. James said nothing. He knew that his words no longer mattered. Soon the truth would be known by someone with real influence. And then Miss Wilson would realize that this was no idle threat. The school assembly that day was business as usual, with teachers and administrators discussing current issues, plans to improve academic performance, and organizational matters. Mr. Thompson, the principal, sat at the table, trying not to meet the eyes of Miss Wilson, who sat proudly in the front row. Her face expressed confidence, as if everything that was happening was just another routine. No one present had any idea that the meeting would take an unexpected turn. As the meeting was coming to an end, the door to the hall suddenly opened, and a tall man appeared on the threshold. His posture and confident look attracted attention at once. It was John Carter, the governor of the state. His presence in the school was so unexpected that the hall was instantly silent. The teachers and administration froze, some in amazement, others in fear. Thompson felt his heart begin to beat faster. Ms. Wilson, who was standing by the desk, stared in amazement at the intruder. Her face contorted as she realized who it was. The governor walked forward with casual grace, but his eyes glittered with determination. He stopped in the center of the room, looking around at everyone present. "My name is John Carter," he began, his voice smooth and calm, but each phrase was like a knife. "I'm the governor of this state, and I've come here to discuss what's happening at this school." Thompson tensed, trying to look as calm as possible. Ms. Wilson was petrified, not taking her eyes off John Carter. She couldn't believe that the boss she had despised and humiliated for months was the son of one of the most powerful men in the state. "I recently learned that my son, James Carter, was the victim of systematic racism and bias at this school," the governor continued. His voice was quiet, but every sound was heard in the hall. The teacher charged with educating the children instead allowed himself to humiliate and discriminate against him. "This is unacceptable." He looked at the teachers, many of whom were beginning to whisper quietly to each other, realizing the magnitude of the situation. Everyone's attention was fixed on Miss Wilson, who stood as if paralyzed, but her face was beginning to redden with anger and shame. "Mr. Carter," Thompson muttered, feeling himself losing control of the situation, "I assure you we will investigate immediately. This is a misunderstanding." But the governor interrupted him. "A misunderstanding?" His voice grew colder. "A misunderstanding when a teacher openly humiliates a child in front of the whole class? When he calls him worthless and says he doesn't belong in society? That's not a misunderstanding, Mr. Thompson. That's a deliberate act of discrimination. And there will be consequences for that." Ms. Wilson tried to pull herself together, her voice ringing with anger and fear at the same time. "I didn't know who he was," she began, trying to justify herself. "I was just trying to maintain discipline in class. Maybe I was too strict. But his behavior, he was defiant. I didn't know he was the governor's son." Carter turned to her, his eyes throwing lightning bolts. "And if you knew he was my son, would it make any difference?" he said coldly. "Or maybe you think it's acceptable to humiliate a child if he doesn't belong to the right class of society, or if his father is not a governor." Ms. Wilson tried to object, but the words stuck in her throat. 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind how this could all turn against her. But deep down, she was still sure she had acted correctly. Her racist beliefs were so deeply rooted that she couldn't admit her guilt. "That boy there," she finally said, her voice shaking with anger and despair. "He acted like he was allowed to do anything. I couldn't let that kind of person to feel superior here." The words echoed around the room. Everyone froze, realizing what she had said. "That type of person?" the governor repeated quietly, his eyes narrowing. "You just showed your true colors, Miss Wilson." No one was whispering anymore. Everyone realized that what was happening was out of line. Teachers who had previously looked at Wilson with respect or even support began to realize that this day could be the end of her career. "I demand Mrs. Wilson's immediate dismissal," the governor said sharply, turning to Director Thompson. "And this is just the beginning. I will personally investigate this matter and bring those responsible to justice, including those who chose to turn a blind eye to this behavior." Thompson felt sweat pour down his face. He realized that if he didn't act, the consequences could be dire, not only for Wilson, but for the entire school. "Mr. Carter," he began with a tremor in his voice, "you are absolutely right. We will begin an internal investigation immediately, and Ms. Wilson will be suspended until it is completed." "Temporarily?" the governor interjected, his voice full of contempt. "She doesn't deserve to work with children. If she stays at this school, I will personally have her fired and sue for discrimination." Ms. Wilson, realizing that her future was in the balance, began to lose control. "It was your son," she shouted, her voice trembling with rage. "He provoked me. He always thought he was above all of us. It's your family that's ruining everything." Her shouts echoed through the hall, making many people wince. She stood in front of the entire room, seething with anger and hatred that could no longer be hidden behind the mask of the strict teacher. John Carter gave her a look full of contempt and said slowly, "You've already ruined your own life, Miss Wilson." John Carter was not a man to let injustice go unpunished. After the humiliating scene at the school assembly, he knew that simply suspending Ms. Wilson wasn't enough. Everything that had happened to his son was just the tip of the iceberg. He realized that racism and bias were deeply ingrained in the system, and if left unchecked, these incidents would continue to happen. The next day, John Carter did not arrive at the school alone. He was joined by a team of lawyers and members of the press. It was his way of showing that he was not just an angry father. He was a governor who would not allow the rights of any child to be violated, regardless of color or background. They entered the principal's office, where Mr. Thompson was already waiting, glancing nervously at his watch. There was uncertainty on his face as he realized that the situation was out of control and that his own career might now be at stake. Miss Wilson had been suspended from teaching, but her fate remained uncertain. Her own statement that she was merely acting in the interest of discipline only made her situation worse. Carter sat down across from the director, putting his foot on his leg. There wasn't the usual smile or friendliness in his eyes. This was a man who had come to seek justice. "So, Mr. Thompson," he began calmly, but there was a cold determination in his voice. "We have to get to the bottom of what happened to my son. I'm sure you realize how serious this is." The principal swallowed, his voice full of tension. "Mr. Carter," he began, trying to remain calm, "we are conducting an internal investigation, and I assure you that all measures will be taken. We will not allow such incidents in the future." "An internal investigation?" Carter squinted, his gaze icy. "This isn't just an incident, Mr. Thompson. This is systemic racism that your staff is enabling. My family has been targeted because of my son's different skin color. As principal, it was your responsibility to make sure this did not happen, but you chose to turn a blind eye." The principal shuddered, trying to find the right words. "Yeah, we will take action," his voice trembled. "This was an exception, I assure you. Ms. Wilson, she made mistakes, but, Carter raised his hand, interrupting him. "Mistakes?" There was anger in his voice. "Mistakes are when a person accidentally does something wrong. And when a teacher systematically humiliates a student in front of everyone, that's not a mistake. That's intentional discrimination. And if you think it's just a mistake, then you're part of the problem." The director turned pale. The situation was beyond his control, and he didn't know what to do. "Mr. Carter," interjected the school lawyer, who had been silent until then, "we understand your concern, but we still have to wait for the results of the investigation. We can't take any definitive action without due process." The governor leaned back in his chair, looking directly at the lawyer. "The results of the investigation?" he interjected sarcastically. "How long does it take you to recognize the obvious? Your teacher openly displayed racist prejudice against my son. There are witnesses, students who saw her bullying him, humiliating him, and embarrassing him in front of the entire class. And you still think you need proof? We have to act in accordance with the laws and regulations, Mr. Carter," the lawyer replied calmly. "You do realize that even in such cases—" "No, you don't understand," Carter cut him off, leaning forward. "This isn't just an administrative matter. This is a crime, Mr. Carter stopped, looking at the paperwork. Mr. Hoffman said, "You're not just defending an educator's mistake, but an act of systematic racism that should not go unpunished. And if you think I'm going to ignore it, you are sorely mistaken." He looked at Thompson. "Not only will I demand that Miss Wilson be fired," Carter continued, his voice sharp and firm, "I will also demand that everyone involved in this incident, including you, Mr. Thompson, be held accountable. This school is subject to the laws of the state, and I am the governor of this state. And if you think your internal investigation is going to bring this matter to a close, you are sorely mistaken." The director sat there, not knowing what to say. He knew it was useless to resist. John Carter was too powerful a figure to ignore his demands. But the worst part was that it could ruin his career. Mr. Carter, the lawyer spoke again, trying to find a compromise. We are ready for dialogue and cooperation. We are ready to conduct an independent investigation. An independent investigation? Carter grinned. Good. I'll provide you with an independent investigation. I'll make sure that federal authorities get involved and that your school is investigated. And if it turns out that these incidents happen not only to my son, but to other students as well, you'll be held accountable to the law. His words hung in the air like a sentence. Thompson and the lawyer looked at each other, realizing they had no choice. We agree, the director finally said, his voice weak. We will conduct an independent investigation. I promise that those responsible will be punished. Punished? Carter rose from his chair, his face expressing determination. They won't just be punished. I will make sure they are never allowed to teach again. And I want Mrs. Wilson fired immediately. Today, Thompson nodded silently, knowing he had no other choice. The governor walked to the door, casting one last glance at the director and his team. And remember, Mr. Thompson, he said in parting, if any teacher in this school dares to show such an attitude toward other students, you will be the first to lose your position. I'll take care of it personally. The door closed behind him, leaving an atmosphere of utter despair in the office. John Carter knew that this was only the beginning. He was already planning the next steps to expose the whole system that allowed people like Sarah Wilson to work with children. A few days after the governor's visit, the situation at the school reached a new level. Information about the racist remarks of teacher Sarah Wilson and the fact that she was victimized by the governor's son quickly went viral on the local news. Soon it became known not only to the people of the state, but also to the whole country. Journalists swarmed around the school asking questions, surrounding the building and foiling any attempts by the administration to shut down the subject. The classrooms were filled with whispers and bewilderment as students discussed how it was possible that a respected teacher could fall so low. Some supported James, his classmates expressed their support, but others, influenced by parents and the media, began to speak out in defense of the teacher. The next day, Sarah Wilson became the center of attention. Reporters came to her class with cameras and microphones, eager for exposure. The entire class felt like it was in the crosshairs, and tensions rose. Wilson, despite her racist remarks, was not about to give up without a fight. At the morning meeting at the school, where Principal Thompson was trying to control the situation, the atmosphere was tense. Parents who came to express their opinions crowded the room, and among them were both those who supported Sarah and those who favored her immediate dismissal. "It's just a misunderstanding," shouted one of the mothers supporting Wilson. "She was only trying to discipline our children. It's a disgrace to lie about her like that." "The shame is what she did to James," replied the other woman. "Discrimination cannot be justified even under the pretext of discipline." Thompson tried to start the meeting, but his voice was lost amidst the discussion. People interrupted each other, and it was only when John Carter issued an official statement that the situation calmed down a bit. "I'm not just James's father," he said, standing in front of the cameras that focused on him. "I am the governor of this state, and I demand justice. I want us to stop racism in our education system. Ms. Wilson has no right to continue working with children if she shows this kind of bias." These words spurred a public outcry. The media began to cover the story extensively, and reporters soon filled the city, interviewing students, parents, and even Ms. Wilson's former colleagues. Some praised her for her rigor and dedication, while others condemned her for her racism and incompetence. Amidst all this, Sarah wasn't about to go down without a fight. She held a press conference where she seemed ready to justify herself. "I never thought of myself as a racist," she began with a tremor in her voice, her confidence slowly fading. "I just wanted James to try harder. It was a misunderstanding, and I'm sure we can resolve the situation." But her words, no matter how well-intentioned, only added fuel to the fire. Many of those present had already made a choice. There was no justification for racism in the education system. Journalists asked uncomfortable questions, trying to understand her logic. "Ms. Wilson, how can you explain your statement that some students don't belong here?" one of the reporters asked. Sarah took a deep breath, her eyes glistening with stress. I was saying it in context. She tried to justify herself, but was immediately interrupted. But you knew it was an insult, the reporter cut in again. You couldn't help but realize that it applied not only to James, but to all students of color. Wilson blushed, her words lost in the chaos of questions and accusations. She felt that her career was hanging in the balance, and her every word could be used against her. As soon as the press conference was over, her image finally fell apart. Meanwhile, a real storm has been brewing on social media. The hashtag Justice for James went viral. Users shared their stories of racism in schools, and it soon led to the creation of a petition demanding the governor conduct an independent investigation into the education system across the state. Support from the public grew. Amid this public outcry, John Carter felt he was making the right moves. His son, James, remained quiet and reserved amid all these events. He knew that his father was fighting for justice, but he also recognized how deeply the teacher's words had hurt him. This situation affected him not only as a student, but also as a person. As the story unfolded, Sarah Wilson began to realize that her life would not be the same. The accusations she had made against James were now turning against her. The press and the public were no longer on her side. There were not only accusations, but also threats. Her name had become a symbol of racism, and she knew she could hardly justify herself. Each new day brought new headlines, and each time her world became more unstable. Sarah soon realized that this fight was not only for her career, but for her reputation, which could be lost forever. There was an atmosphere of panic in the school leadership office. Principal Thompson and his team had gathered to discuss the current situation, but they seemed to be at an impasse. They were under pressure from all sides. Parents were demanding the immediate dismissal of Sarah Wilson, while her supporters insisted that she was only trying to educate the students. "We have to make a decision," Thompson said, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "If we fire her, we lose the part of the parent community that supports her. But if we keep her in office, the community won't forgive us. We risk losing more than just our reputation," the lawyer interjected, his voice strained. "In light of the federal investigation, if we're proven to have supported racist remarks, it will come back on us." At that moment, Sarah entered the office, her face contorted with nervous tension. She had already heard the rumors about her dismissal and was ready to fight for her position. "I heard you discussing my fate," she said, her voice sharp. "I'm not going to leave without a fight. I've earned the right to stay at this school." Thompson looked at her with a weary expression. "Sarah, we understand that you did not do this out of malice, but your behavior has caused a great deal of publicity. We can't ignore public opinion." Sarah began pacing nervously around the room, her eyes burning with anger. "You don't understand. I was only trying to make the kids more disciplined. They don't understand what real work is. You know there are students in the class who don't respect the rules or the teachers, and you decided to humiliate them in front of others?" the lawyer asked, pressing his lips together. "It is absolutely unacceptable." Sarah flushed red. "You want me to just apologize? So I'll admit I'm a racist? I'm not. I was strict because I wanted students to succeed. It's not my fault James is black. It shouldn't affect the way I judge him." Thompson sighed heavily. "Don't you realize that is exactly what racism is? Judging a person based on the color of their skin rather than their actions or accomplishments? It's not racism, it's just reality," she shouted, her voice shaking with emotion. "I need you to understand that there are rules in this school, and not everyone follows them. We need to create an atmosphere where students understand that there are consequences for bad behavior." Suddenly, the office doors swung open and several parents entered the room, escalating the situation. "We demand that this teacher be fired," shouted one of the mothers. "She has no right to teach our children. We are ready to raise this issue at the state level," added another. "You must realize that this is not just an insult to James. It is an insult to all of us." Sarah, standing against the wall, looked as if she had been accused of a crime. She raised her hands, trying to defend herself against the onslaught of criticism. "But I have the right to defend myself," she screamed. "I'm not a racist. I'm a teacher. I was just trying to do my job." However, her words did not help. There was shouting and discontent in the hall, at which time one of the parents rose and pointed at her. "You must leave. Leave and never come back. We will never let you hurt our children again." Running away from the accusations, Sarah grabbed her bag and rushed for the exit, her face flaming with shame and anger. When she left the building, her life seemed ruined. The event was already in the news. Her name had become synonymous with racism. While Sarah fled reality, the school administration remained in the office discussing how to proceed. "We have to be careful," the lawyer said, trying to keep us cool. "I suggest we get together and prepare a public statement. It may help us avoid further problems." "And what do we say?" Thompson asked. "That we support racism, or that we let it happen under our noses?" "We'll just say that we're investigating the situation and that we're open to all opinions," the lawyer suggested. "That would help us get something out of this situation." However, the moment they discussed these options, the director knew that their problem would not go away on its own. Public opinion was changing too quickly, and they couldn't afford to procrastinate. It was impossible to leave Wilson in her position when the entire system was at risk. They soon made a statement to the media, but this only inflamed passions. More protests began to pour in, and the discussion turned into an escalating conflict. Wilson could no longer stay in the shadows. She had a decision to make. Sarah realized that her future now depended not only on her actions, but also on how she could justify her words. But instead, she was surrounded by growing resentment and depression. Her mind was filled with thoughts of how to turn the situation in her favor, how to change public opinion. She realized that now she would have to fight not only the public reaction, but also her own prejudices. Sarah Wilson could no longer be just a teacher. She was now a symbol of confrontation, and she needed to find a way to regain control. On the eve of the final meeting at the school, a spirit of tension was in the air. The building was surrounded by reporters, and crowded protests were mounting on all sides. Governor John Carter arrived at the school to restore order and bring final closure to the actions of teacher Sarah Wilson. He knew that this moment was crucial, not only for his son James, but for all the children who were subjected to racism on a daily basis. The school administration, teachers, and parents gathered in the auditorium. Everyone was excited. Some hoped Sarah would be fired. Others thought she deserved a second chance. Fear, frustration, and, in some cases, support were evident on the faces of those present. When the governor entered the hall, the tension rose to a fever pitch. John looked determined, his voice loud and confident as he addressed the crowd. "We are here today to discuss a critical issue, how we will protect our children from hate and bias. The situation with Teacher Wilson was the catalyst for the changes we must implement in our educational system." Sarah, sitting in the front row, felt the stares of everyone in attendance clinging to her. She knew that her actions had caused not only anger, but shame as well. Her face was burning and as buzzing sounded in her ears. "I'm not a racist," she shouted, standing up as the governor continued. "I just wanted the students to understand discipline." "And what price are you willing to pay for this discipline?" the governor asked, his voice full of determination. "Are you willing to hurt a man just because he is not like you?" Sarah flinched at those words. She was surrounded by parents who were supportive of James and realized that they weren't here to make excuses for her. The governor continued, "Racism has no place in our school. I hope everyone here understands that we need to give our children the opportunity to learn in a safe and supportive environment." After his words, the crowd became noisy. Parents began to shout their opinions, some raising their hands in support, some in protest. The governor led James to the podium. "Here is a man who has suffered from this hatred," he said, pointing to his son. "His words matter, and he must be heard." James, standing in front of the crowd, felt his heart pounding in his chest. He knew this was his moment to talk about what had been plaguing him for all these months. Gathering his strength, he began, "I just wanted to learn. I love math, I love history, but every morning I would come to class and feel like I was different. I don't understand why my skin should be a reason to be humiliated." James's eyes filled with tears. He continued, "I don't want other kids to feel the way I do. No one should suffer because of the color of their skin. A teacher should support, not destroy." The crowd froze. John Carter, standing beside his son, felt proud of his courage, but at the same time could not help but feel pain for the suffering he had to endure. Sarah, feeling her own words and actions destroying her life, soon realized that her excuses no longer mattered. Every rebuke, every tear from James was fatal to her. She looked at him with a dejected expression and realized that she had lost her opportunity to ever be the teacher she had dreamed of. "We cannot allow this behavior to go unpunished," the governor said, and his words rang out like thunder. "I demand that you, the board of directors, make a decision. Firing Sarah Wilson is the only way forward." The governor turned to Sarah. Her eyes searched for an excuse, but he only shook his head, realizing that it was no longer enough. "You made a choice that affected the lives of many children, and you have to answer for it." Sarah felt the ground slipping from under her feet. The whole room was against her, and her dreams of career advancement were shattered overnight. Her last words were unspoken because no excuses could restore her reputation. When the board finally voted, the results sounded like a verdict. The noise in the room grew, but with each passing second, Sarah felt more and more isolated. "Your work as a teacher is terminated," one of the board members said, and that was the final blow that finally broke her. She realized that she could never work in education again. As Sarah left the school that same day, she knew that her actions would leave an indelible mark not only on her life, but on the lives of everyone involved in this horrible incident. As she walked out the doors, James, standing next to his father, felt that his voice had finally been heard. He could feel his power, realizing that he had the responsibility of changing this world on his shoulders. The price of hate was high, but James knew his fight was just beginning. He was determined that his story would not be forgotten, and he would continue to speak out so that other children could learn and grow without fear of judgment. For Sarah Wilson, life changed forever. She lost not only her job, but also her self-respect. All that was left in her heart was fear and loneliness. And as she looked at the world around her, she realized that the hatred in her life had turned into her own defeat. Thank you for your attention and for letting this story be a part of your day. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. See you again.